A significant number of people, perhaps even a majority, agree by default that government should legislate against bad practices like sweatshops and child labor, or that it should legislate to make our lives better by imposing standards. And not only that, but way too many people credit the government for achieving that. But what if such stances are evil? What if the government did not achieve any of that? What if the government simply does not and cannot know how or when such practices could go in that direction? What if the government is just leeching off the market and taking undeserved credit? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is one of those topics that have been on the back of my head for a while but never got the chance to address it. But since while you're watching this I'm in Georgia and with limited capability of following the news, maybe this is a good moment. The contention that I will attempt to prove is that the government, even when it does something that appears to be good, is essentially trailing the market and unfairly assumes the merits for something in which it had little to no merit in achieving. Essentially, when 99% of the job is already done by the market, the politicians step in and pass a law and claim they managed to do 100% of the job. And it is my contention that in things that could arguably be deemed as good and are attributed to the government or legislation, the attribution is mistaken. So the best way I know to argue this point is to give examples. This spares everyone of theoretical discussions and endless what-ifs, while it also spares me of having to think of fancy English terms or complex grammar structures. So, example number 1, the microUSB standard. In 2009, the European Commission, arguably the most useless bureaucracy in Western history apart from the United Nations, issued a so-called Memorandum of Understanding in which technology manufacturers, more specifically mobile phone manufacturers, were required to develop their new products marketed in the European Union to be compatible with a common electric power supply. Much more gobbledygook followed, tons of paper, gas and electricity, waste on various white papers, reports, meetings, more signings, more white papers, and so on and so forth. And in 2012, the European Commission triumphantly reported that all signatures of the memorandum had fulfilled their obligations, and then 1 year later, the EU's publication, Enterprise and Industry magazine, was reporting that, quote, the vast majority of new devices placed on the market today support a compatible charger based on microUSB technology. Unfortunately, the MOU, that will be the Memorandum of Understanding, expired at the end of 2012, unquote. But in an interview with this publication, the European Commission Vice President at that time, Antonio Tajani, explained that, quote, the Commission's ambition to harmonize chargers has no expiration date, unquote. So now you know that the EU has a magazine that hosts interviews, and it's called Enterprise and Industry Magazine. Now, if everyone watching this clicks the link in the low bar, I'm pretty sure the magazine will report next month a tremendous success in online readership, since they'll likely receive more clicks in a week than in their entire existence. I mean, seriously, we all pay for this garbage and no one reads it. And the reason no one reads it is because it's garbage. So I suppose they get one industry concept right. Garbage in, garbage out. Anyway, so the motivation for all this hassle was that having different charges for mobile phones was allegedly a huge environmental problem and an inconvenience to EU consumers. Yeah, an inconvenience. Well, I'm also inconvenienced, quite severely I might add, that the European Commission exists. Maybe they should do something in that direction, such as dissolving itself for good. Anyway, with regards to this issue, the European Commission also argued in its motivation for this that, quote, a user who wants to charge his or her mobile phone must usually acquire a new charger and dispose the current one, even if this is in perfect condition. This unnecessarily generates important amounts of electronic waste. Harmonizing mobile phone chargers will bring significant economic and environmental benefits. Consumers will not need to buy a new charger together with every mobile phone, close quote. Just one problem. Most of that is hogwash. And not only most of that is hogwash, but their post-factum announcement of success was also hogwash. I mean, Apple still used and continues to use proprietary chargers, even though it was part of all the memoranda of intent and understanding and whatever the word is this week for useless papers that the European Union produces. But setting Apple aside for a moment, there were already efforts in the market, long before this initiative emerged, to converge the chargers down to 10 different types of plugs. For instance, this one that I have right here, I have bought it for less than €1 in 2004, 2005, maybe 2003, something like that. Anyway, a long time ago. It was advertised as being compatible with almost everything, and yeah, I kind of have to agree. I mean, I have yet to encounter a telephone that does not fit one of these. So, even if you accept the principle in the argument of the supposed environmental issue, the market had already addressed that more than half a decade before the European Commission came up with their own idea. And more importantly, the market had addressed it without any compulsion. Okay, that was an easy example. Let's try a sensitive and harder one: child labor laws. A lot of people agree and I should have starved to death. Well, nobody puts it this way, but if those militant about banning child labor would have had it their way, I would have never had the opportunity to get a job at the age of 12 and then work for most of the teen years. When I moved out of college, I already had 7 years of experience on the labor market. Most of my peers got their first job at age 22 or even later. And then at age 30 were surprised they were way behind myself in pretty much everything. But besides the morality of allowing minors to get a job and the schizophrenia of most child labor legislation, which penalizes teenagers and families trying to work their way out of poverty, but has no problems with parents exploiting their children in much more harmful ways, so besides all of these, there are two fundamental misunderstandings when it comes to this topic, and these misunderstandings are specific to most of Europe and North America. The rest of the world is much smarter on this topic. The first misunderstanding is given by imagining small children in coal mines whenever someone talks positively or even neutrally about quote-unquote child labor. Now, that may have been true in the past, but barring some African children who work in harsh conditions in mines to forward the progressive environmentalist wet dream of Tesla and other Western welfare whores, what the law defines child labor today is actually quite far from threatening, horrible, or oppressive. For instance, many Mexican teenagers make quite decent money working in their versions of Walmart and Amazon warehouses. The money they make, they usually end up in funding private education or the startup of their own small businesses. A very similar phenomenon takes place in China. I actually had the pleasure to speak with a 35-year-old dude, well, he would be 44 right now, who worked in various sweatshops and other places that would be banned in Europe since the age of and he has been working there since the age of 14. At age 22, he had enough money saved up to quit those jobs and open his first business. At age 30, he had enough money to invest in other businesses, helping the next generation of kids just getting out from the sweatshops. By age 35, he had enough passive income that he could essentially retire. Now sure, not all cases turn out that way, but most do, at least in China. Now I'm not saying this is the best way, nor am I even saying I would have done it, but I am saying that there's much more out there than the usual progressive claptrap of oppressed children. The second misunderstanding is the assumption that banning child labor solves anything. As numerous cases have shown, it actually doesn't. In fact, it makes things worse. For instance, in Bangladesh, many of the children whose work in the clothing and textile and garment industry had been outlawed ended up on the streets in the prostitution trade, spiraling out of control, a child prostitution problem that did not exist before. Because the kids that do work, most of the time, do it because they actually need the money. Outlawing their work doesn't solve the reason they work in the first place. It merely makes their work much harder. Now these two widely held misunderstandings lead to the widely held narrative that sounds something like this. Well, banning child labor is good in and of itself, and it was right and proper for our governments to ban it. There are many things wrong with this narrative, but the one that stands out is the assertion that it's the merit of the government. Except it isn't. In every country in Europe and North America that has taken steps to ban the so-called child labor, the government intervened only after the market had phased out child labor almost entirely already. How did the market do that? Well, by making everyone rich enough that they could now afford to subsidize their children much longer. No society, past or present, has managed to pull itself out of poverty without putting its children to work. It's really that simple. Now, this analysis may sound cruel, but as many of you already know, life is cruel and unfair, something which even UNICEF had to admit and work with. It may sound compassionate to want to abolish child labor by any means necessary, but it's not. It's very cruel. What actually is compassionate is to try to gradually adopt technologies and other market means that slowly improve the situation for everybody, including working children, and slowly phase it out, just like it happened in Europe and North America. As I explained in the video where I defended Beyoncé for using sweatshop labor, prosperity doesn't come overnight. Sweatshops were very common in the United States in 1935, or in France in 1950, or in Germany as late as 1965. Heck, even Sweden had a few of them way into the 1960s. Eastern Europe had them way into the 1990s. There is no magic formula to speed things up. The sweatshop is a necessary phase in a country's road to prosperity. No prosperous country of today has become prosperous without having had sweatshops and, yes, widespread child labor in the last 50 years. Some forms of hardline child labor, such as children working in tobacco fields, is still legal and widespread in the United States today. And that's perfectly fine. Rural folks in the very poor areas of the US also need to progress, and they will, provided they're left alone. Countries like South Korea have managed in less than 40 years to achieve what Europe achieved in over 200 years. In 1970, South Korea looked like Britain of 1810. Now it is the equal of Britain in terms of standard of living. Okay, let's try another example. The roaming fees. Whilst I was in Sweden in the current year, an EU directive came into force that allegedly abolishes roaming fees. According to the official narrative, this is the pinnacle of a 10 years effort which has progressively been lowering roaming charges. Thankfully, my operator allowed me to use the policy I had before this nonsense came into force. Sadly, most operators in the western half of the EU were not so generous. The result? Everyone pays more. Well, except Czechia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland, which are the only countries with a free market telecom system and in which the EU nonsense is rightfully held in contempt. Now, if we are to believe the fans of this policy, this is a tangible benefit of being part of the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. Look, it protects us from evil predatory corporations, they say. Well, not so fast. First of all, roam like home type of policies have been around for more than 10 years. I know because I use them. It is no surprise that only 20-something millennials are excited by this policy, and that's because they were either too poor or too young or even not born at all to have had a mobile phone in, let's say, 1997 or 2002. Secondly, even in highly regulated economies such as Sweden and the United Kingdom, the price of mobile services have continuously gone down in the last 20 years. Sure, in some countries they went down faster and more spectacularly, and the correlation has a lot to do with the lack of regulations. The more unregulated an economy, the more spectacular the price fall. But nevertheless, the prices had been going down long before the European Union got involved in this. Moreover, policies with specific benefits while roaming have been a thing since at least 1999. Yes, it meant that those who used more paid more, but normal people call that fairness. So even if we are to believe the EU narrative, which we shouldn't, and I'll explain in a moment why, but even if we are to believe their story, this is at best a measure that socializes the costs. In other words, poor people who rarely leave their country, much less afford a vacation, are going to pay slightly more so that the richer and more privileged folk, if you want, will roam like home. Now isn't that lovely? Now, the problem with the EU's narrative is that it looks compelling because it contains scientific lying. 50% truth, 30% spin, and 20% outright lies. The true part in the EU's narrative is that roaming prices kept on dropping even faster after they got involved in this 10 years ago. What nobody will tell you, though, is that the prices started falling much faster than previously as of 2004, 3 years before the EU even wrote its first internal memo about this. And the reason is simple. Technology and competition via market capitalism is what drove and continues to drive the prices down. The market did that, not the government. I'm old enough to remember when receiving a call while being roaming cost $9 a minute. Dollars, because the euro had not been invented yet. By 2004, it had already dropped to under €1 per minute. By 2007, it had already dropped to less than 50 euro cents per minute. That's in Europe, using a Romanian SIM card. Today, operators in Romania offer almost roam-like-home services in Hong Kong, South Africa, Ghana, India, or Egypt. 5 cents per minute, even lower if you're on some policies. So unless South Africa or India join the European Union, and I haven't found out about it, I think there is a case to be made that the prices have been going down faster than the so-called EU price caps. In other words, the government, well, the European Union, was trailing the market. And after the market had done 95% of the job, the EU came along as a savior in a shining night and demanded the remaining 5% of the job be done slightly faster than the market would have done it anyway. And in doing so, the EU gained a few points with disdainful Euro-fanatic socialists, but I repeat myself, and also in the process harming the poorest telecom consumers in Europe. What a fabulous achievement! Ultimately, it is not bad that the government is trailing the market. Whenever it tries to go ahead of the market, everyone is worse off. Every single time. So it is the natural order of things for the market to solve real or perceived issues as billions of transactions make that demand heard. What is bad is the government taking credit for it when it really shouldn't. In the last example, the EU doesn't even get the points for staying the hell out of the way. Instead, it got involved much faster and hurt much more people in the process. At least when it comes to the other examples, such as child labor laws, the government passed the laws long after no sweatshop existed anymore. So we can toss those as politicians virtue signaling on the backs of the market. But these are not the only examples. The electricity outlet sockets is another example. Governments took credit for standardizing them even though the standards imposed themselves via market means decades before any such legislation existed. Heck, the EU even took credit for taking down the Internet Explorer monopoly. Yes, Really. The only problem is that they took credit for that in 2010, 1 year after they fined Microsoft for monopolistic prices, but also long after Internet Explorer had already been dethroned by the market already. Thankfully for the European Union, someone told them they're pathetic before they issued a communique in 2012 in which they wanted to also claim to have saved us from the monopoly of Windows Media Player, a product that hadn't been a thing for 10 years. I wouldn't be surprised if some government in the future proposes a limit on Nokia phones and then claims to have saved its citizens from the burdens of a monopoly. Now, it sounds funny when you put it in this way, but never underestimate the daftness and the ridiculousness of politicians. They'll always find a way to surprise you. Anyway, the main point is that in most, if not all, of the cases of the government saved us from this or that, the claim is either misleading or outright false. Even on environmental issues, governments take a disproportionate amount of credit for improving the environment when in reality, in most of those cases, the market had already done 90% or more of the job long before there was even a whiff of talk about legislation. And in some cases, the government can actually make things worse, such as with poverty. Relative poverty drops much slower in welfare states than in non-welfare states. In fact, the only places where relative poverty is increasing these days are exactly the places with huge welfare states. Venezuela, Sweden, France. Notice anything in common? So, next time you meet someone praising the successes of the state for this and that, keep in mind that it's likely a lie. Always check the timeline of the issue. Was the issue already getting better before the legislation? If yes, how much better? Has legislation actually accelerated things? If yes, how much? If not, did it leave the trend unchanged or it slowed it? Because at least if it left it unchanged, then you can file that under innocent virtue signaling. Ultimately, what I'm saying here is to always ask the Thomas Sowell test. At what cost, compared to what, and what hard evidence do you have? In most of these situations, you won't get to the third question because it's either a prohibitive cost or a crappy comparison. So, do you know of other examples of government taking the credit for an achievement largely brought by the market? Except the realm of national defense, although even there's a lot of market involvement, can you cite an example of an economically interventionist policy that actually worked and that actually made things better? I'm sure there are some of those, though not very many, but let's discuss them. So, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Follow me on the usual social media, and I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.